Welcome to Too Fond of Books. My name is Janelle, and this is another 3 Agatha Christie books in my Agatha Christie read-through project. Now, I'm a little behind on filming for this because I actually have 6 books to talk about, but that would make this video way too long. So I'm just going to stick with 3. And first up today is Taken at the Flood. This was published in 1948, and the other title for it is There Is a Tide. This is a Poirot mystery with a lot of Shakespeare references. Now, if you've watched any of my Agatha Christie read-through project videos, then you'll know that that's one of the things that I'm keeping my eye on in this read-through, is that Agatha Christie she quotes other authors a lot, but she really seems to like Shakespeare. And so I've been noting anytime there's a Shakespeare quote or reference that I get. Sometimes it's not like blatant, and so sometimes I miss it. But if I catch it, I make a note of it. I also note with the Poirot books, I've been keeping my eye on anything that helps me to understand his investigative method, the things that are important to him. And so those are some of the things that I watch for when I read Poirot. Now, Taken at the Flood was an extra fun read for me this time around because I buddy read it from Marilyn, the baby boomer booktuber, and so it was really fun to read this mystery with her because we read mysteries very differently. So when we chatted about it, we were mentioning different things, which made the conversations really interesting. Because I'm all about the plot. I'm all about looking for the clues, the red herrings, and trying to solve it myself before the solution is revealed. Marilyn is all about the characters, and so she was really highlighting certain things about the characters that I maybe kind of wasn't paying as much attention to, and she was also really invested in how the characters related to each other. So it was a really fun conversation to have. I really enjoyed my buddy read with Marilyn. All right, so let's just start right away with the Shakespeare references in here because there's one already in the title. The title, Taken at the Flood, is from Julius Caesar, and the full quote is at the beginning of the book. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune. Omitted, all the voyages of their life is bound in shallows and miseries. On such a full sea are we now afloat, and we must take the current when it serves, or lose our ventures. Unsurprisingly, there are a number of times when that quote or part of that quote shows up in the story. I'm just going to interject here for a second. I realize I never said what this book is about. Okay, so this book is about the Claude family. And during the war, Gordon Claude, who is the wealthiest of the family, is killed in an air raid in London. He is at home with his new young wife, Rosaline, that none of the rest of the family have met. And that happens during the war, and that's kind of the prologue. We learn that story of the fact that Gordon died in this blast. His wife survived, his wife's brother survived, as well as a few of the servants or staff in the house. But then the story advances a few years to the family members, and there are 5 people who desperately need that money, and Gordon was always free with his money when he was alive and helped out his family members as they needed it. But Rosaline and her brother are a little more stingy with that money. And so you expect, with a story set up like this, that the person who is going to be killed is Rosaline, but it's not. And so that's as far as I'm going to go with this until I get to the spoilery section. So let's continue on with the Shakespeare quotes. There's a character named David who is, he is thinking to himself, and he says, and we must take the current when it serves or lose our ventures, which is part of that quote from Julius Caesar. And then Another one late in the book, enter first murderer and enter second murderer. Don't quote Shakespeare, groaned Spence. This isn't Elizabethan drama. But yes, it is very Shakespearean. There are here all of the emotions, the human emotions in which Shakespeare would have reveled, the jealousies and hates, the swift, passionate actions, and here too is successful opportunism. There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. So you know from that quote that this book is basically going to be all about money, that the motive is going to have something to do with money. Or does it? That's the brilliance of Agatha Christie. One more, Poirot murmured, there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood, leads on to fortune. Yes, the tide sweeps in, but it also ebbs, and it may carry you out to sea. All right, there were also a couple of things I keep my eye on. I am building an Agatha Christie universe, so I watch for characters that reappear in stories. And in this book, that happens. What doesn't happen in this book is stories or characters from other series showing up in a Poirot book. But in this case, we do have George the valet is in this book. He appears sometimes. He is Poirot's valet. And then we also have the detective in this one is Inspector Spence. And he mentions Inspector Japp, who is kind of, I would say, the most famous of Agatha Christie's inspectors. Chief Inspector Japp always said, you have a torturous mind. And of course, he's talking about Poirot. And I have a couple of quotes from the books that I wanted to highlight before I get into some spoilery stuff about Taken at the Flood. The opening paragraph I thought was great. In every club, there is a club bore. The Coronation Club was no exception. And the fact that an air raid was in progress made no difference to normal procedure. So the book opens with a prologue set during World War II in London. It's 1944, and Jeremy Claude overhears a story told in the club about Rosaline's first husband, and Poirot is there. And so this is a really key prologue. There's a lot of good information that you need to pay attention to. The main action of the story, though, is 1946, after the war. Then there is this absolutely hilarious scene where Mrs. Lionel Claude, her name's Kathy, she comes to see Poirot. Monsieur Poirot, she said, I have come to you under spirit guidance. Poirot blinked slightly. I thought that was absolutely hilarious because, of course, we know Poirot is all about order and method and science and facts and rationality, and he doesn't really know what to do with a character like Kathy Claude. And so then it was hilarious. Their conversation continues, and she says, my poor brother-in-law Gordon, immensely rich and often mentioned in the press. He was killed in the Blitz over a year ago, a great blow to us, to all of us. My husband is his younger brother. He is a doctor, Dr. Lionel Claude. Of course, she added, lowering her voice, he has no idea that I am consulting you. He would not approve. Doctors, I find, have a very materialistic outlook. The spiritual seems to be strangely hidden from them. They pin their faith on science, but what I say is, what is science? What can it do? There seemed to Hercule Poirot to be no answer to the question, other than a meticulous and painstaking description embracing Pasteur, Lister, Humphrey Davy's safety lamp, the convenience of electricity in the home, and several hundred other kindred items. But that, naturally, was not the answer Mrs. Lionel Claude wanted. In actual fact, her question, like so many questions, was not really a question at all. It was mere rhetorical gesture. So good. All right. And then I noticed as I was reading that a couple of times this concept of ill will popped up Here's a quote from page 38. There were waves in the air of feeling, a strong electrical current of, what was it? Hate? Could it really be hate? Something, at any rate, destructive. And then later, we get this ill will again. Lynn is having a conversation with David, and they have quite this long conversation about ill will. We'll learn to stand on our own feet. We'll stop feeling ill will. Ill will? Yes, I felt it first one night at Aunt Kathy's. And then they go on and have this conversation about the ill will. Another huge part of this story is identity and whether or not people are who they say they are. And I want to talk about that a little bit, but it could get spoilery. So I'm going to do spoiler now across the bottom of the screen. And get into some of this. In this story, and of course this is spoilers now, so I'm going to assume that you've read this story or that you just don't care. The true identity of people is a key part of understanding and solving this mystery, and of course I was looking out for that. So you have Rosaline is a young woman who meets Gordon Claude and marries him on the boat, I think, from going from the US to the UK. And then they are in London during the Blitz, and Gordon gets killed. And all of this happens before the rest of the family is able to meet Rosaline. And then in the prologue, we hear this story about Rosaline's first husband. She's a widow, and her first husband died out in the bush in Africa. But before he disappeared and was presumed dead, the story came out that he had a fever. He had told he had told a friend that, things weren't going well in his marriage. And he said, if I disappear and then you hear one day of an Enoch Arden, then you'll know that I've gotten away. So there was always left this, from the very, very beginning of the book, you're always wondering whether or not Rosaline's first husband is alive or not, and you're aware of this name, Enoch Arden. And then during the present timeline, 1946, a man shows up in the village where the family lives, where the Claudes live, and he goes to stay at a hotel, and he gives his name as Enoch Arden. So of course you are right away hugely suspicious. Who is Enoch Arden? What is his true identity? Is he Rosaline's first husband? Is he someone else pretending to be Rosaline's first husband? You have all of these questions. So right from the beginning, the idea of true identity is in your mind as you're reading this mystery. And so as you continue, I realized that there were other possibilities for people who may not be who they say they are. As I was reading, I started to think about David Hunter, that maybe he isn't who he says he is. He says he's Rosaline's brother, and the family, of course, would love it if he is not Rosaline's brother, because he is keeping a very tight hold on Rosaline's money. But then there is also the possibility that Rosaline isn't Rosaline. Rosaline, there's a quote here, Rosaline says to David, "No, it's wrong. It's been wrong all along. Taking money that doesn't belong to us. I lie awake nights thinking of it, David. Taking what doesn't belong to us. God is punishing us for our wickedness." Rosaline says that. So of course you've got family members who would love it if Rosaline or David weren't who they say they were, and there's, they're implying or giving gossip that maybe David and Rosaline are actually married or something like that. So then that raised the question for me, it could be because Underhay is still alive, Underhay is her first husband, or that Rosaline isn't Rosaline. So what I started doing was making tabs in the book, I don't know how well you can see that, for the clues that led me to consider whether Rosaline was actually the maid, because in the when we hear the story in the prologue, we learn that David survives, Rosaline survives, and a maid survives. And it makes me wonder if Rosaline actually died in that air raid, and that the maid, David convinced the maid to pretend to be Rosaline. And then there was this great quote, or this from Poirot, and he says, "People do not change." And so again, that was another big clue for me as I was reading this. So I did really enjoy Taken at the Flood. It was a good Agatha Christie. The last chapter though was, yeah, I didn't like the last chapter. And since we're being spoilery here, I'm just gonna say flat out, Roger, is it Roger? Rowley, who is one of the Clodes, is engaged to Lynn at the beginning of the book, and he turns out to be the killer, and he tries to kill her. He is found strangling her in the kitchen of his farm, and in the end, she stays with him. Like, it's so hard for us to wrap our minds around that. And I'm like, what are you doing? Is that insane? And why is he not in jail? So the ending of this was crazy, but it was a good Agatha Christie. Ultimately, I did enjoy my read of that. And then I read Witness for the Prosecution and Other Stories from 1948. This is also a short story collection, and there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. There are 9 short stories in here. 2 of them were rereads for me. Okay, so the one that I was the most excited about was Witness for the Prosecution. It's one that I have not read yet, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. I loved it. It opens with an interview between a solicitor and his client who has been charged with murder. And this became a very famous play as well. I thought that it was really tightly plotted, and it had a great reveal. The next short story was called The Red Signal. And this one was, so what was interesting was I started to notice a trend. After Witness for the Prosecution, the stories seemed to have this, I'll let you know as we continue. So The Red Signal was all about this unconscious awareness of danger and heredity. And so that one I quite enjoyed as well. I gave that one 4 stars. So already we're getting this, this unconscious awareness is starting to come up. And then like psychology and hypnosis and stuff like that starts to be what pops up in the stories that come up next. The next one was called The Fourth Man. 4 men in a carriage on a train, a canon, a lawyer, and a doctor, and the 4th man. And they end up talking about the story of this girl in an orphanage, and 2 girls in an orphanage, and they talk about the double soul, and there ends up being like stuff about like multiple personality possibly, or not even multiple personality, but like whether or not a soul can inhabit a living person. Another soul can inhabit a living person. Then we had the story Sos Mortimer Cleveland, who is an authority on mental science, breaks down and seeks shelter at the isolated Dinsmead home. And again, in that short story, there was this premonition of danger. So I thought this was interesting. They really, it seemed like, other than Witness for the Prosecution, they were gathering together these stories that were about unconscious feelings and psychology and all of that. The next story is Where There's a Will. Mrs. Harder is a wealthy old woman with a weak heart who starts to hear messages from her dead husband on the radio. And again, in that one, there was the concept of the premonition. Then we have The Mystery of the Blue Jar. While playing golf, Jack hears a woman cry, "Murder! Help! Murder!" This one also had the subconscious, supernatural, psychic phenomena, and doctors of the soul. So very interesting. A reread for me was Philamel Cottage. I really enjoy this one, and partly it's because I don't understand the ending. I don't think I quite get it. Alex and Gerald Martin and Derek Windyford are the main characters in this one. And Alex meets Gerald and they get married and they live in this isolated cottage. And Dick Windyford is a man who knew Alex before from her previous job and was in love with her. And there's mention of hypnotism, jealousy, and the subconscious. And so I'm going to put spoiler on the bottom of the screen here because I have to put it out there. If you've read Philamel Cottage, let's chat in the comment section down below because I have so many questions. Was the husband a killer? Was Alex a killer? Did she just remember the article that stated his weak heart and then tell a story hoping he would die? I'm curious. I would love to hear other people's opinions about a Philamel Cottage. And then we have the story Accident. Evans is a retired inspector and he comes across a woman he believed had gotten away with killing her husband. And in that one, Evans has an encounter with a fortune teller that plays a huge part in the short story. That was also a reread for me. And then The Second Gong. This is a country house party Poirot short story. I really enjoyed this one too. A man is found shot in his locked study. And this one also has the gathering of the suspects at the end. So this was a great short story collection. And I loved getting a chance to read Witness for the Prosecution. I really, really loved it. And then last but not least is Crooked House. This is an Agatha Christie that I had never read before, and I was really excited about it. I had heard a lot of good things about this. This is a standalone Agatha Christie, and it's told in first person. It's narrated by Charles Haywood. Aristide Leonidas died at Three Gables with his numerous loved ones around him, but it was murder right enough. The suspects, his young wife and her lover, and the motive, hundreds of thousands of pounds, were obvious. Too obvious. Because the truth was that any one of the denizens of the vast and rambling house could have killed the grand and generous old man. All murder is unnatural, but this one was beginning to look a little more unnatural than most. So this was an interesting read for me, and I did really enjoy it. But it didn't end up being a 5-star for me because I figured it out. And I felt like I figured it out too easily. So it was a great story with great characters, but because I figured out the solution, what I felt was too easily, I couldn't give it 5 stars, but I did really, really enjoy it. I'm going to put spoiler on the screen here so that I can talk about some stuff without worrying about whether or not it's spoilery. As I was reading it, I thought it was unusual that there were 2 death notices in the newspaper for Aristide Leonidas, one put by his wife and one put by his children and grandchildren. So right away, I think for the reader, you get this impression of distance, that the family, the children and grandchildren, are distancing themselves from his new young wife. There are mentions of the war in this one. If the right, which I thought was interesting, it doesn't always happen with Agatha Christie, and I'm finding as I do this reread, or this read through, that she more often mentions the war after the war is over than during the war, which makes sense to me. A number of people used the phrase, if the right person did it, which I thought was really interesting and something that I should pay attention to in the book. We get murder by chapter 2. He is poisoned, and so I like that it's right away we get into the murder and into the solving of it. Agatha Christie does seem to really like nursery rhymes, and this one is no different. There was a crooked man, and they all lived together in a little crooked house. Sophia is one of the family members who knows our narrator, Charles Haywood, and asks him to investigate, to look into what's going on in the house. And she describes the different kinds of ruthlessness in her family. And it was a fascinating part of the story and really telling. So she talks about her grandfather, Aristide, who had a casual ruthlessness. Her grandmother her ruthlessness comes from no imagination. Her mother is ruthless because she is an unconscious egoist. Clemency, who is an aunt of Sophia's, is a scientist, and so she's cold-blooded and impersonal. She has a cold-blooded, impersonal ruthlessness. Her uncle Roger has a terrific temper. Her father is too well controlled, no emotion. And Sophia admits that she could murder someone for something really worthwhile. So that was a really interesting little bit of the book. And so some of the notes, here are just some of the notes that I made as I was reading. Usually when a rich person dies, it's because of money. But Mr. Leonides was not a miser. He gave a lot of money to the family already. So although he is a very wealthy man who dies and there's a lot of money involved, I never got the impression that money was going to be the motive behind his murder. I thought it was interesting, the phrase came up, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. I also thought it was interesting that Sophia produces her mom. Her mom is an actress and is overly dramatic, melodramatic, and almost acts like everything is a scene in a play. And so there was this description of a scene with Sophia and her mother, and it really felt like Sophia was producing for her mother. And then here's a quote from chapter 10. He was a generous man to his family, but he was not a man to waste money on unprofitable enterprises. And then there was this interesting soliloquy about murderers on page 110 that I want to read for you. So this is Charles Hayward's father, who is kind of high up in the police. What are murderers like? Some of them, a faint, rather melancholy smile showed on his face, have been thoroughly nice chaps. I think I looked a little startled. Oh yes, they have, he said. Nice ordinary fellows like you and me, or like that chap who went out just now, Roger Leonides. Murder, you see, is an amateur crime. I'm speaking, of course, of the kind of murder you have in mind, not the gangster stuff. One feels very often as though these nice ordinary chaps had been overtaken, as it were, by murder almost accidentally. They've been in a tight place, or they've wanted something very badly, money or a woman, and they've killed to get it. The break that operates with most of us doesn't operate with them. A child, you know, translates desire into action without compunction. A child is angry with its kitten, says, I'll kill you, and hits it on the head with a hammer, and then breaks its heart because the kitten doesn't come alive again. Lots of kids try to take a baby out of a pram and drown it because it usurps attention or interferes with their pleasures. They get very early to a stage when they know that it is wrong, that it will be punished. Later, they get to feel that it is wrong. But some people, I suspect, remain morally immature. They continue to be aware that murder is wrong, but they do not feel it. I don't think in my experience that any murderer has really felt remorse. That perhaps is the mark of Cain. Murderers are set apart. They are different. Murder is wrong, but not for them. For them it is necessary. A victim has asked for it. It was the only way. So that was a really interesting soliloquy on murder, and that was also a huge flashing light for me that it was possibly the child who was the murderer, and of course I was right that it was Josephine. I thought that was brilliant for Agatha Christie because she does write fair play mysteries. You can figure it out, and so she knew that readers are never going to think of a child as the murderer, and so she gives you a fair chance by laying it out there as a possibility on page 110 that children can be murderers and what their type of motives are. So yeah, I thought that was interesting. I thought it was also interesting that there were references to true crimes in here. They talk about Constance Kent, which was a true crime from the Victorian era where a girl killed her little brother. And then there was a reference to Thompson and Bywaters as well, which was a famous case, and I believe that they were lovers who killed her husband, I think. And then I also had a quote. This has nothing to do with the mystery. I just liked this description. It was a big room full of books. The books did not confine themselves to the bookcases that reached up to the ceiling. They were on chairs and tables and even on the floor. And yet there was no sense of disarray about them. I loved it. That's my kind of library. So, some thoughts. 150 pages in. This is what I wrote down. I was 150 pages in, and the story is 223 pages long. Although I don't have a motive yet, I think it's Josephine. I think the family know and are trying to protect her and convince the police that it's Brenda. Right away there, I had it right. I didn't have the motive yet, and I was partially right about the family. Because it was an interesting case where you knew it was going to be a family member, and so you had family members protecting each other or trying not to believe that it could be one of them. And so it was convenient for them to think that it was the new wife or the tutor who you find out that they were in love with each other. But really it was only the aunt that was protecting Josephine because she had figured it out. And I also wrote, although Leonides was wealthy, I don't think money is the motive. Family devotion is going to play into it. Maybe what people will do to protect those they love. And so that was interesting because that didn't have anything to do with the murder itself, but it did have a lot to do with the person who was protecting the murderer. So there you have it. That is Crooked House. So those are the three in my Agatha Christie read-through projects: Taken at the Flood, Witness for the Prosecution and Other Stories, and Crooked House. So let's chat in the comment section down below. Have you read these books? What were your thoughts about them? And I will see you for another video soon.